Lord, give us focus as we go into your word. I pray that your Spirit will guide us into understanding and that we won't just be interpreting Scripture according to our own limited human minds, but that you will give us insight to better understand what you wanted us to take away from it when you inspired the original author to write it. And that we won't just gain knowledge from this, God, but that we'll also gain wisdom and that we'll learn how to actually live for you better in the days and weeks and months and years to come. And that as a result of studying the Word, both individually and together right now, that we will be better shaped into image bearers of you. That we will be better equipped to go out into the world to live for you and to love you and love others. Help us set aside any distractions that would keep us from focusing on you, God, and help us give all of our attention and devotion to you, because you deserve it all. We love you. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. We are in the 18th chapter of 2 Samuel. I know it's kind of sad, but we are slowly but surely making our way to the end of this long, epic journey that we have been in for, we're getting close to probably a year now, huh? Just with the, basically 1st and 2nd Samuel, right? It's probably been about a year since we've been in this. And we're getting close to it. There's only 24 chapters. We've got 6 chapters left. And yeah, kind of sad, but we're almost there. And so today we find ourselves talking about the death of Absalom. But some of y'all have missed some weeks. Some of y'all are here for the first time. Some of y'all, might just need a refresher because in order to know the importance of the death of Absalom, you probably need to know who Absalom is. In order to know who Absalom is, you probably need to know who David is, because David is Absalom's dad, and really this is David's story, not Absalom's story. And so there's some context that needs to be recapped. And over the last few weeks, I've been the one doing the recapping, but I think it's time for me to let y'all flex y'all's recap muscles. And could I get somebody to, and I'm asking for a brief summary, right? Could somebody just tell us the context of the nation of Israel right now and who David is? As brief as possible, but give us the information we need.
I'll try.
Go for it.
So, David is the second king of Israel, following King Saul, who was a failure. And whereas Saul failed to lead the people, spiritually, David does well. And however, shortly after, sometime into David's reign, he has a great sin with Bathsheba. And though he's forgiven by God, God still tells him that there's going to be consequences and there's going to be lots of family conflict going on. And so far, even now, we're seeing the results of that. And so sometime after David's sin with Bathsheba, we're seeing that his sons, there's lots of conflict going on. One son sleeps with their sister, and that happens to be Absalom's sister, so he kills Amnon, and that starts all this stuff. Absalom leads a conspiracy. David has to flee Jerusalem, and for a time he has been in exile. But before David left, he stationed people in Jerusalem to be kind of like spies for him. And so far we've seen a few of those people: the high priest and a advisor of David's named Hushai. And last week we saw that Hushai, he was kind of David's inside man for Absalom. And so he helped take down the other big conspirator, Ahithophel. And so last week we saw the fall of Ahithophel, and so that basically does it this week.
Yeah, perfect. That was a really good summary. Yeah, so I've talked about it multiple times. Yeah, round of applause. I've talked about it multiple times how I really believe that 1st and 2nd Samuel are the height of not only biblical literature, but probably just literature in general, given how much is going on and how much is packed into just like a very short story. I mean, whenever you take, we've spent almost a year studying it, but 1st and 2nd Samuel, if you were to just have a book, it's really short compared to the books that we write nowadays. I mean, the Game of Thrones books, I've never read them, but they're huge and they pack all this stuff. 1st and 2nd Samuel packs so much into so little, and everything is so precise, and there's so much going on to where we had, like Sean mentioned, we had King Saul, I mean, really, we had, first off, Samuel, who was a prophet. That's why it's named, like, the books are named after him. Samuel's the one who kind of gets this whole story kicked off. Then you eventually have Saul, who's the king, who's not a great king. And then you have that followed by David, and we've been with David this whole time. And David's just this superstar. And we see so much about him being great, but then at the same time, he's not perfect. And so we get the idea that he's not the ultimate chosen one we've been waiting for since Genesis. And really, these last few weeks, we have kind of seen David at the lowest point of his life. If possible, even lower than he was once he learned about his sin with Bathsheba. Right? Well, he'd known about it, but once he was called out on his sin with Bathsheba. That got him to a really low point. But now, here David is, and he has been forgiven by God, but he's having to reap the consequences of his sin, which is horrible, because he gets to see how much his sin has affected not just him, but everybody. And so, like Sean pointed out, we've got just his entire family falling apart. Amnon is his eldest son, and he rapes one of David's daughters. And then Absalom kills Amnon, and then David and Absalom have this rift between them, and then eventually David tries to fix things, but he doesn't really do a very good job of it. And then finally, once he does try to do a better job, it's too little too late. And Absalom leads this whole conspiracy against David. David has to flee because he wants to spare the people from having to go into battle, and he doesn't want Jerusalem to collapse. And he flees. But like Sean pointed out, he plants these spies. And really, we've just seen this, like, there's a lot of political intrigue in these chapters, to where there's a lot of names being thrown around, and it almost feels like a Christian version of Game of Thrones, in the sense of there's so many names, and you're having to try to keep track of all of them, whereas in the earlier chapters of Samuel, it was pretty straightforward, right? There's Saul over here, David over here, and like, you keep track of everybody. Now, there's like all these names, and there's all these like interweaving families and stuff, to where it's really difficult to keep track of sometimes. But we're doing a good job. And today, a lot of that confusing stuff is going to kind of come to an end, because the conspiracy of Absalom is going to come to an end. David, like Sean pointed out, as he escaped Jerusalem, he appointed a few people to be spies who were kind of feeding him information. The key person in all of this was a guy named Hushai. And like Sean pointed out, in the last week, we had Hushai and Ahithophel as the two advisors to Absalom. Ahithophel was the Judas figure who had betrayed David and actually gone to Absalom's side, and Hushai was the one who was acting like he was a traitor, but really he was a double agent, right? And Ahithophel had the better advice, but Hushai came in and acted like Ahithophel's advice was terrible and gave bad advice that he was able to make sound like good advice, and Absalom ultimately took that bad advice. Do y'all remember what exactly Hushai had suggested that Absalom go do?
Fight David himself.
Yes. Yes, well, maybe let's start off with, what did Ahithophel say? What did Ahithophel say they should do? When should they attack?
When they have an army together.
That night.
That night. Ahithophel had said, attack this night. Don't give David a chance to regroup. And then who did he want them to attack specifically?
The mighty men.
Just David.
Just David. Right? Remember, so Ahithophel said, attack him tonight and just attack David, because Ahithophel didn't want there to be a lot of casualties, because he realized that's not the best way to cement your power. The best way is to take out your enemy and show that you're compassionate and gracious to everybody else. Right? So Ahithophel was suggesting that. Hushai comes in, and he starts spinning this whole story, which is partially true. He's like, hey, we all know that David's a scrapper, and he knows how to survive. And if you attack David right now, I can guarantee you he's expecting you to do that. And he's waiting for you. And you're going to try to attack him, and he's going to pounce on you, and you're not going to see it coming. Really, Hushai's just trying to buy David time. Right? He's trying to buy David time to gather some people together and attack. But he says, no. What you want to do is you want to wait until all of Israel is behind you. And then when you're ready, you march out there, and you don't just destroy David, you destroy all of David's army. Right? You assert your dominance, and you show that you are a king not to be messed with. Right? And so this really teases Absalom's pride. And Absalom's like, all right, yeah, I like Hushai's advice. And Ahithophel hears this, and what does Ahithophel go do? He hangs himself, right? Like I said, he's a foreshadowing of Judas, right? The one who betrays David and then ultimately goes and hangs himself. And so Ahithophel hears this, and he realizes, oh man, if they're going to take this type of advice, this is not good. And so he goes and kills himself. And then where we leave off is we actually have everybody preparing for war. Right? David goes off, and he's with his group of people at a city called Mahanaim. This is the place where Ishbosheth made the capital before David became king. Right? And then Absalom has gathered his army together. He has appointed a commander in charge. And now they are crossing the Jordan River, and they are heading over to go meet with David and clash. Now we're going to see that battle, and the battle's going to go down very quickly. And then we're going to see the aftermath of that over this chapter and the next chapter. Sound good? All right, cool. Sean, would you read verses 1 through 5 for us?
Okay. Then David numbered the people who were with him, and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent the people out, 1/3 under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you also. But the people said, You should not go out, for if we indeed flee, they will not set their heart on us. Even if half of us die, they will not set their heart on us. But now you are worth 10,000 of us. So now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city. Then the king said to them, Whatever is good in your sight, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. Then the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king commanded all the commanders concerning Absalom.
All right, there you go. So, what do we see happening here?
He divides his army up by Joab and his brother, and I think I don't know who the other guy is, but
Ittai the Gittite. We've talked about him. We'll talk about him again in a second. So he's dividing the army, and then what happens?
They get ready to go off to war.
They get ready to go off to war, and then what happens?
David says he's going to go.
Okay, David says he wants to go with, but then what do they say?
No.
No. You're staying here. You're too important. And so then David ends up just being at the gate as they leave. All right, let's break it down. Then David numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. Right off the bat, what does this suggest?
there's a bunch of people.
Here's a bunch of people, which suggests what?
That he's going to win.
Maybe.
Like
More.
time's passed?
That's mainly what I'm going for. Yeah, time has passed, right? Because obviously, you don't just get thousands of people overnight, right? Whenever we saw David leaving Jerusalem, he only had a few hundred people with him, which is still quite a bit. But now he's got so many people that he's separating them into hundreds and thousands. So apparently, between chapter 17 and 18, some time has passed, and a lot of people came to David, right? So even though David left Jerusalem, just like whenever he was on the run from Saul, people came to David. And even if the greater majority were behind Absalom, mainly probably because they're just confused about what's going on, the greater majority were like, no, we're with David, and they go with David. So David numbers the people who are with him. He set them over the commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, and he sent the people out, and he splits them into 3 groups, right? This is something we see happen throughout the Bible. Genesis chapter 14, I'm pretty sure Abraham does this whenever he's going out to, I think it's whenever he's going to go retrieve Lot. Maybe he splits the people into 3 groups, or it could be something in Genesis 14 where that happens. And then also in Judges, remember with Gideon, he splits the people into 3 groups. This is just a common battle strategy. You know, you can have the 3 groups in different places so that you're not just attacking from one side, you're surrounding them and attacking. So he sends people out, 1/3 under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 out of the hand of Ittai the Gittite. All right, let's talk about those 3 people real quick. Who is Joab?
Commander.
He's the commander of David's army. What's his relationship to David?
Niece, nephew.
Nephew, yes. He's the nephew. And what is our rule? What is our the phrase that we constantly need to have in our mind whenever it comes to Joab?
Don't screw.
You don't mess with Joab, right? Joab is a ruthless character. We have seen him throughout the 1st and 2nd Samuel, and the more we see of him, the more we realize he is not a guy to be messed with. We're going to see that again in this chapter, right? And in the next chapter. Joab is a guy who is fiercely loyal to David and partially loyal to Yahweh, right? There's times where he has shown some devotion to Yahweh, but he seems more devoted to violence than to anything else. And so that's who Joab is. And then the second person is Abishai, son of Zeruiah. We talked a little bit about Zeruiah last week and stuff like that. But who is Abishai? It says it right there.
Joab's brother.
Joab's brother. All right. Where have we read about him before?
Fighting Abner.
Yeah.
Yeah, fighting Abner, right? We saw that before there. And then he also showed up a few chapters ago. Remember where there was this one battle where like he had Joab and Abishai like going two different directions as well as commanders. But there was a third son. What happened to him?
He died by Abner.
Yeah. What was that guy's name again?
Also,
Asahel. There you go. Yeah, remember Asahel was chasing after Abner, and Abner killed Asahel. And so what did Joab do to Abner? Killed him. Yeah. Because once again, you don't mess with Joab. You kill Joab's brother, you're going to die. Keep in mind, Joab originally kind of supported Absalom. Right? Remember back at the beginning of this whole thing, Joab's actually the one who tried to get David to reconcile with Absalom. But do you remember what Absalom did to Joab?
Burned his field.
He burned down his fields, right? Because Absalom wasn't responding to his text messages. Right? Absalom was over here being like, hey man, we need to talk. And Joab didn't respond. And so Absalom burned down his fields. And what do we say about Joab? Don't mess with Joab. So do you think Joab's a big fan of Absalom anymore?
no.
Probably not. So we'll see that in a little bit. So 1/3's under Joab, 1/3's under Abishai, son of Zeruiah. But since there's not that third son anymore, they need somebody else to put in charge. And I guess David likes to keep it close. So he appoints somebody who might be kind of surprising. Ittai the Gittite. Gittite, that means that you're from Gath, which is the city that Goliath was from. Right? So this is a Philistine guy. But where have we heard of Ittai the Gittite before?
He's the one, whenever David was leaving, and he was one of the men that, followed him and went with him, and he was like, why would you follow me when you've only, been a servant of mine for, a week? And he was, saying that he was really loyal to David.
Yeah.
He would serve him.
Yeah. So this is a guy who really owed nothing to David, but he showed devotion to David. Right? I mean, literally, if you read it literally, it seems to suggest that he literally showed up with his men the day before David and them escaped. Whether or not it's literally the day before, I don't know, but that's how they phrase it. He, as they're leaving, David turns to Ittai and says, y'all just arrived yesterday. You don't know anything to me. Just stay here in Jerusalem. I'm not going to ask you to, you came here, I'm not going to ask you to just, flee with me into the wilderness. And Ittai says, where you go, I go. He kind of pulls, the whole Ruth and Naomi thing. He's like, I'm going with you, man. I'm devoted to you. And so David seems to honor that. And he elevates Ittai to being in charge of 1/3 of his army, which is just kind of cool, right? It's he's like, okay, if you're going to be with me, you get to be a leader, because he has seen that this guy is devoted, as are Joab and Abishai, right? They're all devoted to David's kingdom. So he appoints them, and the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you also. What we're going to see here, interestingly, is that the advice that Ahithophel gave to Absalom is unintentionally going to be the advice that plays out with David's army. Because Ahithophel suggested that Absalom should stay back from war and that somebody else should go out. And Ahithophel suggested that rather than killing everybody, that they should isolate David and kill him. And instead what's going to end up happening is that David's going to be the one who stays back and Absalom's going to be isolated and Absalom's going to be killed. So unintentionally, David's going to end up taking Ahithophel's advice, which was the better advice. But David doesn't start off that way. He says, I myself will surely go out with you also. Why does he say this?
Because he's their king. He wants to do them right.
Yeah, there's multiple reasons, right? One is that he's their king, right? He is their leader. He owes it to them to do that. What's another reason?
He doesn't want to create another Tamar.
Bathsheba situation?
Bathsheba,
Yeah.
Bathsheba situation.
Another reason is because he stayed home from war before, and that didn't go well for him. And so he's like, no, I am going to go out to battle with y'all, right? And so that's two reasons already, right? He is their king, and he stayed home from war before, and he doesn't want to replicate that. A third reason is probably because he feels responsible for this, right? This is not y'all's fight. This is my fight, right? I am the reason we're on the run. It was because Absalom despised me. He wants me, not y'all. I should be the one leading the army because I'm the one who put y'all here. However, that last reason is the reason why they're going to insist that he doesn't go fight with them. But the people said, "You should not go out. For if indeed we flee, they will not set their heart on us. Even if half of us die, they will not set their heart on us. But now you are worth 10,000 of us. So now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city." So how do they respond to him?
We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we think it's best you stay back because we really just want you dead, not all of us.
Yeah, like, basically they're saying, like, yeah, we appreciate it, but you're too important to this fight. They don't care if we die. Literally the only person who matters in this entire battle is you. If they kill us, they're not going to care. If half of us die, they're not going to care. The one person they want to get to is you. And if you fall, we have nobody to turn to. The only reason we're on your army is because we believe that you are the anointed one of God who is worth supporting. So if you fall in battle, we have no choice but to go serve Absalom. We've got to keep you safe. Right? Like, you can't be out here fighting for us because they don't care about us at all. The only person they want to get to is you. And that means that even if we're fighting out here, all of us are going to literally have to be surrounding you anyways. You're not even going to be able to fight. Right? So if anything, he would actually be a distraction to the battlefield, because rather than be able to focus on the fight, they would have to be focusing on specifically covering David, because the other people, they're not going to care about attacking random unnamed soldiers. They're just going to kill whoever they can in order to get to David. Right? He is the high value target. Right? He's the HVT of this whole thing. It's like, no, like, you're the one they need. And so we need to protect you at all costs. Yeah, you shouldn't go out. For if indeed we flee, they will not set their heart on us. If we end up having to run away, if the battle goes downhill and we are not winning and we flee, then we're done for. Right? I mean, like, the thing is, they're not going to chase after us. Like, in a normal battle, if the soldiers flee, then guess what? Everybody just chases after the soldiers and goes and kills them. But if David is out on the battlefield and the soldiers are fleeing, they're not going to chase after the soldiers. They'll let them live. They don't care if those guys live or die. Now, they just have to kill David. And so then David's just a sitting target. Whereas it's much better if they just keep David hidden away in a place where he's safe, and then they go fight the battle so that the people who are fighting have to destroy them in order to get to David. Right? So they're really actually, it's kind of a beautiful portrait. Like, they are laying themselves down for the sake of David. Right? Because if David were out there, then their lives wouldn't be in nearly as much danger. But his life would be at supreme danger. However, if he stays home, then their lives are the ones at danger, and they are the only thing that stands in between Absalom's army and David's. Which is, it's just really beautiful. It shows how much love and care they have for David, that they would rather put their own lives at stake in order to protect him than have him go out here and, they'd be free to go. Does that make sense? It really shows a whole lot. Whereas Absalom's army didn't show nearly as much care, did they? They're just like going with Hushai's advice. Whereas Ahithophel suggested the same thing, right? Ahithophel was like, well, really, the only thing that people want is you. So you stay back, we'll go out, and we'll just kill David, and we'll bring about peace. And then we'll be done. But then Hushai's like, no, you need to dominate there. And really, the same is true with Absalom. If Absalom's done with, then the battle's over. Like, it's really, like, there's two armies here, but really only two people actually matter, right? If Absalom is taken out, there's nobody else to lead. So everybody else comes to David's side. If David is taken out, there's nobody else to lead, everybody goes to Absalom's side. It's not like the Saul and David thing where if, like, one person falls, there's, like, this whole lineage to, like, come up after them. It's just one versus one. If anything, it's more like the David and Goliath fight, which is kind of ironic. But, yeah, so Absalom's side, they didn't show nearly as much care. Once Hushai suggested, yeah, we should go out there and you should lead us, everybody's like, yeah, he should lead us, because they don't really care about Absalom. They're just caring about the glory they have to get from it. You are worth 10,000 of us, so now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city. So it's kind of like what he had said to Hushai. Remember whenever Hushai was wanting to come out of the city with them? He says, you're actually better for me if you hang out in the city, because you would actually be a liability to us out here, whereas you could do better work for us from the city. And so they're telling David, you would actually be a liability to us out on the battlefield. You can do more work from the city where you can call shots and you can tell people to go out. And if you need to send more soldiers, you can send more soldiers. But for now, Just stay back home. Then the king said to them, whatever is good in your sight, I will do. Which is just really cool, right? We just see the humility of David there. The fact that he is the king, yet he's taking the people's advice. Because these people have demonstrated their devotion to him, right? He trusts them. He's not here to just lord his power over them. He sees that they have his good interest at heart. And ultimately, not just his good interest, because if that were it, he probably wouldn't care, because I don't think he cares as much about his own life. I think that he realizes that they are trying to protect the Lord's anointed one and defend the Lord's kingdom. And so he says, okay, whatever you say, we'll go with. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. What's kind of cool about that detail?
He's making sure his men are well taken care of as they're going out off to war.
Yeah, so he might not be going out to battle with them, but he's also not holding up in some palace or anything. He stands right at the gate and he sends them off, right? So it's like his heart is going with them. It kind of goes back to the imagery of Absalom. How did he win over the people? Do you remember where he was at?
The gate.
He was at the gate, right? The gate is the place for the common people to gather together and do official work. And so David is not holed up inside some fortress. No, he's at the gate. He might not go out to battle with them, but he will see them as far as he can. He's at the gate, sending them off, and he's going to stay at the gate. And he's going to wait at that gate. Next time we're going to see him, he's going to be at the gate waiting for news, which is a place we've seen him before. Right? We saw him there whenever the news about Saul came back. Remember, whenever he was waiting at the gate to hear news, and they brought back news about Saul's death. And then we've also seen other people at a gate before, too, haven't we? Way back at the very beginning of Samuel. That's imagery you're really going to want to remember. Who was at the gate at the very beginning of Samuel? 1 Samuel.
Was it Eli?
Eli. Yes, Eli was sitting at the gate waiting for news of a battle and for the fate of his sons. Right? David is going to be in the same situation as Eli, and we're going to have to see how he responds differently or the same. It's like poetry. It rhymes. Right? Okay. So the king said to them, whatever's good to you on your side, I'll do. So the king stood beside the gate, and the people went out by hundreds and thousands. Then the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, his three commanders, and this is what he says. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. What is his one command?
Don't
Be
kill
nice,
Absalom.
Yes, don't kill him. Right? Bring him back alive. Deal gently with him.
Keep him safe.
Because ultimately, this is a civil war. Right? What is the easiest way to end this?
For them to mend fences, basically.
Well, either to bring about peace, but Absalom has made it very clear that peace is not an option. So now that peace is not an option, what is the quickest way to end this? Kill him. Right? That's the easiest way. Right? And that is what Ahithophel suggested they do to David. Right? Go out and kill David. That is the only way to end this war. Because peace is no longer an option, and if you leave him alive, there's always a chance he'll rebel or something again. Right? And so murder is the only easy solution to this. But David asked them not to do that. Why? It's his son. But also, even beyond it being a son, I mean, you do see an element of it because he calls him the young man Absalom. Right? Before, he was really, a few chapters ago, we saw him holding this bitterness against Absalom, where he just wouldn't even have Absalom anywhere near him. But now that he sees how far, all these things Absalom's doing, it's almost like Absalom's like a young boy in his eyes again. Right? The young man Absalom. He's just acting like a kid. Right? This is just a rebellious kid doing what rebellious kids do. And just let him live, and we'll mend this. David still seems to hold out hope for peace. But even if this weren't his son, I think David would suggest the same thing. Because this is how David, in general, treats his enemies. Right? We have never seen a place where, David loves sparing his enemies. Do you remember how he responded whenever he heard about Saul's death? He killed the guy who reported the news. Do you remember how he responded whenever he heard about Abner's death?
Created a song.
Yeah, well, he sings about these people and he mourns them, but he also kills the messenger who tells about the death because he loves his enemies, right? This is why David is a beautiful portrait of Jesus, because David really embodied this in a very extreme way. Like, whenever we think of loving our enemies, we're not typically thinking of, like, battlefields. We're thinking of, like, people who, like, said something mean to us. David is literally on the battlefield, yet he always wants to be gracious towards those who are oppressing him. It's actually really impressive. Like, he's literally embodying that ideal. To where Saul is chasing after him, and David finds him in a cave, and he has the opportunity to kill him, yet he doesn't. And then there's another time where he has the opportunity to stab Saul through with his own spear, the spear which Saul has thrown many times at David, and he doesn't do it. And whenever David hears about Saul's death, he weeps about it, and he cries, and he murders the person who acted like it was a good thing. And when he hears about Abner and Ishbosheth's death, he's sad about it, and he mourns about it, and he shows kindness to the families of his enemy, right? Like, this is just who David is. And so I think that there's part of this where he loves his son. And now he's more sober-minded about this, and he thinks that his son's just being a kid, right? And we don't know how old Absalom is. It seems like he's probably about 40 years old right now because of some stuff that we read about earlier. But in David's eyes, he's just a young man, right? Just spare the young man. But then there's also the fact that this is how David treats his enemies. He likes being gracious and compassionate. So this is the one thing he says. Deal gently with Absalom. And all the people heard when the king commanded all the commanders concerning Absalom. This was not something where he pulled them aside and said, hey, deal kindly with him. He made this a public thing. Like, before he sent them out to battle, he said, guys, hey, Ittai, Abishai, Joab, everybody listen up. Y'all three, bring him back alive. Bring my son back alive. Deal gently with him. Everybody heard this. Which means that everybody's going to know that something's wrong whenever that's not how this goes down. Let's move on. There's a typo on this next little slide. It's supposed to say 6 through 8, but that's all right. Sean, could you just read the next 3 verses?
Then the people went out into the field to meet Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And the people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David. And the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. And the battle there was scattered over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured.
All right. So we have all this build-up, and then that's the battle. The battle's actually super short. And then we'll get to what happens to Absalom in a second. But yeah, so I have some pictures here, just because there's a really fun little detail here at the end of verse 8, where it tells us that the greatest, even more powerful than the sword at this battle was the terrain itself, to where it's almost like the earth itself was fighting on David's side, which is interesting. So, let's just walk through it. Then the people went out into the field to meet Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. On the left here, I've got this map, and the red shaded area is the forest of Ephraim. You'll notice that it is not located in the region that is allotted to Ephraim, right? Because Ephraim is one of the tribes. That's over there to the left. You see that? Okay, so that's the land of Ephraim, but because of a long, convoluted explanation that we don't need to get into, the forest of Ephraim is actually over here to the right, to the east of the Jordan River, which is where they were already at. If you see at the very bottom there, see how it says Mahanaim? That is where David was currently stationed at, and Absalom and his people were just coming up the Jordan River from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's at the bottom of where you see Benjamin right there, right? So they just came across the Jordan River. They were coming up north, and they went and they fought in the forest. I can almost guarantee you that David is the one who chose this location. Because most likely, Absalom had the bigger army, and David knows how to fight, and his men are probably trained better than Absalom's men. And so he realized it was probably to his advantage to fight in a place that was not the best place for battle, right? Because if he was out in an open plain where it was just flat, most likely the numbers would have won out, and Absalom's men would have won. However, if you're fighting in a forest, David's men, they're scrappers too. They know how to do guerrilla warfare, and they know how to fight, right? And so what we have here is they go in this forest, and I believe right here, this valley, I believe that is what you would see here is like the Jabbok River. I'm not sure. It could just be another little valley here. This is the forest of Ephraim, right? So it's a hilly area. It really, almost all of that is the forest, but I imagine we're actually in like the trees and stuff because we're going to see that in a second. But it's a very hilly, rocky area. You see it a little bit over here to the right where just a lot of different crevices and just twisting stuff. Not the best place for a battle. And you can imagine how, if things get chaotic, it might not just be the swords doing the damage, right? If people are fleeing left and right, and if it gets into a total frenzy, and people are fleeing for their lives, they're tripping, they're falling on stuff, they're falling down hills, they're running into trees. There could be some damage just from the terrain. And that's what we read. The people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David. And the slaughter there was great, 20,000 men. So 20,000 people die in this battle. I'm assuming from Absalom's side. And the battle there was scattered over the whole countryside. So it's not just relegated to like one select area, like a lot of battles are, right? A lot of battles are just like very contained to like this one spot. The idea is that the battle started here, and very quickly Absalom's guys realized that this was not going well for them, and they're scattering everywhere, and it just turns into mayhem. It's over the whole countryside, to where it's just people getting slaughtered left and right. And this is the fun detail. The forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. The word for devoured there in Hebrew is literally to eat. Like, to devour, yeah. So the forest ate more people than the sword ate. What do y'all think about that?
I think of Narnia.
Think of
Yeah, I
Narnia?
think of Narnia.
Okay.
Main thing I thought about when I first read it last night, I'm like, Narnia.
Do forests eat things in Narnia?
Or actually, there's some other movie, but it was an extended edition of
Lord of the Rings,
Lord of the
I know,
Rings,
I
you
know.
I thought that too. So, actually, no, that was the main thing I thought about.
Yeah.
I'm like, so it's a lot like the forest
Yeah.
and Born.
What's that?
I was thinking of another show, The 100.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
that's a good show.
Yeah. But obviously, so whenever it says the forest is devouring people, it's not talking about like a miraculous, like a, crazy thing where the forest is coming alive and eating people. It's nothing like that.
Running in a tree.
It's just the idea that literally the battle just sent people into such a panic that they're probably just running and trying to flee, or even in the act of fighting, they're tripping and they're falling and they're hitting their heads on things, and the casualties, like, it's just kind of pointing out that they're fighting in a very dangerous space, right? It's not like Star Wars where you can fight over this, like, bottomless pit and you can fight on these, like, little guardrails and somehow never fall. Like, no. Like, this is reality. These people are fighting in a dangerous place, and the place where they're fighting at is hurting them, right? And if any, like, it's also kind of cool, though, because I think the narrator highlights this, because obviously the detail isn't that important. The narrator who wrote the book, he's highlighting this to point out something. What do you think he's trying to point out?
The fact that there was a great many people that were dying from the war.
Yes, but almost maybe theologically or something. What would be the significance of this?
Maybe that God is playing a big part in the war, that he's maybe fighting for them more than the men are.
Yeah, right? It's not even David's men who won the battle. It was God's creation itself that won the battle, right? So Absalom lost, but it's not like David's men are the ones who received the praise. It's almost like God himself was fighting for his anointed one.
It's almost like Judges with Barak in the army.
Yeah, or like Gideon, right? Where Gideon, he split people into 3 groups, and they never even raised a sword because people were sent into chaos. They ended up killing each other, right? This is just what God does, right? And so I think it's a very subtle detail to where it's not supposed to be something inherently miraculous, but if you're thinking about a person who is writing this, they're like, technically David didn't even need his soldiers because God would have won the battle for him anyways. It's just kind of a little cool detail, and I find it fun. And so there's that. Now let's move on to the climactic moment of this chapter, and then the rest of it's the response. All right, Sean, verses 9 through 15.
Okay. Then Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Now Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him passed onward. Then a certain man saw it. He told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Then Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." So the man said to Joab, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not send forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you, and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Keep for me the young man Absalom.' Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there was nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Then Joab said, I will not wait around here before you. So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and put him to death.
Alright. The death of Absalom. By the hand of Joab. Why? Because you don't mess with Joab. That's for burning my fields. Yeah, alright. Then Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Just happened to happen. Right? The idea is that the army has lost the battle. Absalom's probably fleeing for his life. And who does he happen to come across? But the people in David's army. It's interesting that they're not called the soldiers of David, they're called the servants of David. Just because that's how they identify themselves, right? They're the ones who followed David into the wilderness. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Now Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. Alright, so he's riding on a mule. What does that suggest? Like, when a person's riding on a mule, or for Absalom, what does this probably suggest?
That he was fleeing.
Fleeing, but, what's that?
A king?
Yeah, he's like a king. Yeah, because he's riding on basically his royal mule. This is his royal steed. Right? He's riding on his mule, probably fleeing, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. Right? So he's going through the forest, and the forest didn't just devour his army, it's going to devour him as well. So he's going through the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him passed onward. Interesting. So, he's passing through the oak, and somehow gets caught in a tree? What could possibly get caught in a tree?
Bunch of
hair.
A bunch of hair. Does Absalom have a bunch of hair?
Oh yeah.
It surely does.
Yes. How do we know that?
Yeah, it's delicious.
We talked about whenever you would cut it off and weigh it every year.
Yes. Yeah, he was known for his hair. He had so much hair that every year he would cut it off and weigh it, and it was 5.5 pounds worth. Right? This dude literally, like this was his claim to fame. This was his glory. It was his pride. But pride comes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. So you have this bitter irony that the very thing which Absalom held so dear to his heart, the very thing which was his claim to fame, the very thing which all the girls fawned over him for, was the thing that was his own undoing. Here he is fleeing. You can imagine his hair rustling, like flowing in the wind. He goes through a tree, like a bunch of he's in the forest. There's a bunch of trees. All of his men are dying left and right, and he's just ducking, trying to get through stuff. And then all of a sudden, that majestic, beautiful hair gets caught in the branches, and his mule just keeps on running, and he's left dangling, defenseless, between heaven and earth. Just think of the imagery of that, right? Dangling between heaven and earth. What does that sound like?
Like he's really high up, it sounds like?
Well,
like his feet.
the imagery. Dangling between heaven and earth.
Maybe he was knocked unconscious.
Kind of like the people before they choose to accept Jesus or not.
Okay. Yeah, so there's almost like this, the imagery of like, he doesn't belong to either. It's almost like heaven and earth are both rejecting him. But also, is there anybody else that we've recently read about who might have been described as, I mean, it didn't use that language, but who could be described as dangling between heaven and earth? Maybe in the last chapter. Ahithophel? How did Ahithophel die?
He was hanging.
He hung himself, right?
Yeah.
The imagery, dangling between heaven and earth, right? Now, he's not dying in the same way, but the imagery is the same. He has met the same end as Ahithophel, right? There's this poetic justice to it. Ahithophel was the traitor who betrayed David. Absalom is the son of David who betrayed David. He is the foreshadow, like they're both foreshadows of Judas, basically. And they all end up hanging between heaven and earth. Meanwhile, where does the mule go?
Right underneath.
Away. All he can do is hang between heaven and earth as the image of royalty rides in the distance. His kingdom literally rides away from him. Right? So the imagery is very satisfying in a kind of dark and almost tragic way. Here he is, rejected by heaven and earth, his kingdom riding into the distance, and he can do nothing other than realize that the very thing in which he was most proud has brought about his greatest fall. And he's just hanging there. And it's like, I mean, he's probably struggling trying to get his hair, but what can he do? Right? Because as he's hanging there, the servants of David come by. Absalom. The mule was under him and passed onward. Then a certain man saw it. He told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Hey, Joab, I got some good news for you. I found Absalom, and it's kind of embarrassing for him.
Merry Christmas to me.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to me. That's what Joab's thinking, right? So, hey, I found him. He's hanging in an oak. Then Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." So how does Joab respond?
You pass up the perfect opportunity.
Yeah.
Or so much.
Dude, this is like Israel's most wanted right now. This is the number one person that we want dead. Why did you not kill him? If you killed him, I would have given you money. Man, that is worth a prize. But why wouldn't he kill him?
Because David said it.
The king kind of commanded us not to.
Yeah.
So what does this suggest about Joab? This is where we see the political intrigue really coming up.
Still holding a grudge.
Well, he's holding a grudge against Absalom, but we'll get there in a second. What's that?
He's calling the shots now.
He's calling the shots now, right? I mentioned earlier how Joab is fiercely loyal to David, but it seems like this is where we begin to see that Joab thinks he might be able to run the kingdom better than David, right? So he is loyal to David's kingdom, and he will fight to the death for David's kingdom, but it seems like he thinks that maybe his uncle's getting a little bit too old and not willing to do what needs to be done, right? Which there might be credit to that from a political perspective. Right? David was being gracious and wanted to spare his son, but technically what Joab is suggesting follows the counsel of Ahithophel. Right? If we want to end this and we want to bring about peace, Absalom needs to die. I don't know. However, he is opposing the Lord's anointed one, and so I would suggest that he's probably in the wrong. So Joab says to the man who told him, "Now behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike to the ground? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." Just the fact that he's willing to say this to somebody else, he is publicly declaring that he does not care about the king's command. Right? Like, this is like public disrespect. David outright told them in front of everybody, treat Absalom gently. And then Joab is so confused, being like, why did you not kill him? It's like, I mean, you heard the king's command. He said not to. And he's like, I don't care what the king said. I would have paid you money to kill him. It's like, whoa. Like, this is crazy. Like, you're one of the commanders in chief. Like, this is kind of sketchy territory for Joab to be publicly stepping into right now. So the man said to Joab, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not send forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Keep for me the young man Absalom.'" So how does the guy reply?
He reminds Joab that, didn't you hear David tell us, keep him alive?
Yeah. He's like, dude, 10 shekels of silver? I don't care if you gave me 1,000. Multiply it by 100, I would never consider violating the king's command. Like, you can see that even this dude is like kind of appalled by the idea of like, why would you not listen to David? Like, David's amazing. He's the anointed one. He's our king. Why would you not listen to him? I don't care how much you paid me. I would never touch him. And he also is like, you shouldn't be surprised by this. We were all there whenever he commanded this to you. It's not like he just told me that. He told you that specifically. And we were there. Like, he's genuinely baffled by the fact that Joab is even suggesting something like this. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. So what does he say there?
I'm under your command, and if I killed him, the fault would have been on you.
Kind of. I think he might be taking that a little bit of a different direction.
I just thought it wouldn't have blame. He was going to be a blame.
Yeah, so what does it mean if he's saying Joab would have stood aloof?
Is it talking about the fact that he could be staying alone, like he would have been banished from the king?
What does the word aloof mean?
Isn't normally people connected or
Not
disconnected?
friendly or forthcoming, cool and distant.
Yeah,
Yeah,
distant,
distance.
right? Aloof, distant. So he's saying, even if David hadn't commanded us to not kill Absalom, if I had killed him, David would have found out, because nothing can be hidden from the king. David knows, like, he's got informants. He can figure out stuff. I mean, literally, we know that, like, David knows how to plant spies, right? He says, if I had killed Absalom, David would have found out, and you would have stood aloof, Joab. You would have been distant. So what's he saying?
You were then shunned, basically, right?
Well, it's not saying that Joab would have been shunned. Joab would be doing the shunning of who?
David.
Not David.
Of him.
The dude who killed Absalom. He's like, yeah, even if I had killed Absalom, David would find out, and he'd hold me guilty of that, and I know you wouldn't be coming to my defense. Right? Like, it's not like, you might give me 10 pieces of silver and a belt, but that's not worth much whenever the king kills you for killing his son. And Joab, I'm going to be honest, I don't think you come to my defense in that situation. Right? Like, you would be like, oh, sorry. Like, basically he's saying this would just be an easy way out for you. If you want Absalom dead, you go kill him yourself. Because if you're wanting me to go kill him, no. That's just easy out for you to where you could just, basically do the Pontius Pilate, wash your hands clean of the blood, and be like, oh, David, I'm so sorry. This man over here, he killed your son. I didn't want him to. Oh, he might tell you I gave him money. I didn't do that. Like, but that's basically, he's saying, like, Joab, you wouldn't come to my defense in this situation. I'm not doing this. I have nothing to gain here. Then Joab said, I will not wait around here before you. This is where Joab pulls the Thanos. He pulls out the Infinity Gauntlet. What's he say? I'll do it myself. Right. So he took 3 spears in his hand, and he goes over there, and he thrusts them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak.
Yikes.
That's a crappy way to die. Hanging by your own hair.
Yeah, and there's nothing you can do, right? He's literally just caught in a tangle of his hair. Like, the irony is just so great. Like, also notice the thing. This is not the first time that we've had somebody who was well known for something about his head who died in a head-related injury. Who was the first person we saw? Who? Saul. King Saul. What was King Saul known for in regards to his head?
Being ahead of the boat.
He was a head taller than everybody else until he died. Because how did he die? He was decapitated.
He lost his head.
Ah, look at that. Right? So the thing in which, like the physical attribute which set him apart from everybody and which was his crown of glory, brought about his undoing. Same thing here. Absalom, known for his hair, left dangling from his hair, and all he can do is hang defenselessly as Joab comes out and pierces him 3 times with 3 different spears through the heart. There's also interesting imagery here, to where, in a weird, twisted way, this kind of foreshadows the gospel. Because if you read the Old Testament, like in the Torah, it says that a person who hangs from a tree is cursed. Right? They fall under the curse of God. Paul is going to quote that verse in relation to Jesus hanging from a cross. Right? He became the curse of God. And here you have Absalom, who is hanging from a tree, and through his death, he has a curse brought upon him, and technically through his death, he brings about peace for Israel. Right? In some weird, twisted way, it kind of foreshadows the gospel. Other than the fact that he is the counterpoint to Jesus. right? Whereas he is like the epitome of sinfulness, whereas Jesus took on our sinfulness and hung from a tree, and through his death brought about peace, right? And so, like, through Jesus' death, the exiled people of God in their sin were able to be restored into the kingdom of God, right? Through Absalom's death, David, the exiled king, will be restored back to Jerusalem. So, like, there's some weird, like, poeticness to this, which I just think is kind of cool, because it's almost like Jesus became an Absalom for us, right? That's kind of like the imagery of whenever he died on the cross. So he hangs there defenseless, and he's pierced with 3 spears, and I also highlighted that because Jesus was also pierced. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around. I love that there were 10 young men. Like, how much armor did Joab have? 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and put him to death. So apparently he didn't die just from the spear wounds. Joab called some other people to help him finish the job. Why do you think that would be the case?
So he's not the only one.
Yeah, well, if you do it this way, you can never really say who did the final job. Who was it who killed Absalom? You know, like, imagine that conversation between David, right? Who killed my son? Joab's like, you know, David, who can say?
It was a group effort.
Right? It was there were a bunch of us there. We were caught up in the moment. I don't know who it was. It could have... I don't know, right? It helps spread the blame. If he's the only one who did it, then he's definitely going to die. But if he spreads the blame, he can spare himself a little bit longer. Because Joab knows David. And he knows David's command. And David said, don't kill Absalom. And he also knows how David responds whenever people report the fact that his enemies have been killed. And so he does not want to be the only one to blame for this, because that would not end well for him. Joab is very politically savvy. And so he's like, hey guys, help me finish this off. But it's just a really nasty end for Absalom, right? Just hanging from a tree, being stabbed and cut and just brutalized by just a bunch of different guys. But that leads us to the rest of the chapter, which is just going to be a response to Absalom's death. Sean, could you read verses, let's just do 16 through 18 first.
Yeah. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest and set him over a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself a pillar which is in the king's valley, for he had said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day.
Cool. So there's like kind of just like the final little closing touches to Absalom and what happens to him. We'll just go through it quickly. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. So now that Absalom is dead, the battle's over, right? Because that was really the only person. It was, like I said earlier, once Absalom or David is dead, there's only one ruler now. Like, there's nobody to replace them. And so whoever died, everybody else is going to serve the other person. So he's like, okay, guys, battle's done. We're all friends now. Everybody go back home. It's fine. And they took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest and set over him a very great heap of stones. They don't even give him a proper burial. Right? They don't gather him together to be buried with his family or anything like that. Instead, they just apparently found some pit in the middle of the woods, threw him down there, and then threw stones on him. Which, I mean, there's a kind of fitting into that. I mean, the punishment for a lot of the different crimes that he committed, if you go into the Torah, a lot of the crimes he committed would be punishable by being stoned to death. Well, he's already dead, but he's covered by stones, so kind of works-ish. I don't know. They took Absalom, cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and set over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. So the people of Israel are like, when it says all Israel, it's talking about the people who supported Absalom. Right? They keep fleeing. The battle's over, but they're just like, we're out of here. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's valley. For he had said, I have no son to preserve my name. So he named the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. What's up with that?
He's wanting people to remember him.
Yeah.
Just have no kids.
Who does that sound like?
So?
Saul. Saul did something similar, didn't he?
He put a statue of himself in what's the place? Gilead?
Was it Gilgal?
Gilgal.
Gilgal. Yeah. Absalom and Saul, very similar people, right? It's just kind of funny. Like, they're establishing monuments for themselves. That's such an arrogant thing to do. But Absalom, he does mention something kind of weird here. He says he has no sons to preserve his name. But if you go earlier in the chapters, we do read that Absalom had some kids. And it would seem to suggest that maybe they had died, or maybe he erected this pillar before then or something like that. I don't know. That's a kind of weird thing that we don't need to spend a lot of time on. But if you go a few chapters earlier, it does say Absalom had kids. So maybe they grew up and they died in battle, or they died of diseases or something. But for some reason, he felt the need to establish this. I just find it hilarious. Like people like this, Saul and Absalom. They're just like, I need to make a statue so the people will remember me. And it's like the version points out, it is called Absalom's monument to this day, right? So at the time that they were writing this, there was still a monument for Absalom. And if you go to Jerusalem nowadays, over right outside the Garden of Gethsemane, there is, traditionally speaking, a monument dedicated to Absalom, but I don't think that, it doesn't date back to that time. I think it was a much later thing that they just have called Absalom's monument or something like that. But when people go by it, they spit on it. So it's okay, you erected a monument, but that's only helpful if you leave a good reputation. Instead, you've just basically given people this thing to constantly remind you of how terrible a person you are. You went down in history as the guy who led the shortest rebellion ever as you rebelled against your father, who everybody loved. So good job, Absalom. Congrats.
People spit on it?
Yeah. Yeah. Tuh. Yeah. We don't like Absalom. Yeah. All right, verses 19 through 23, Sean.
23.
Yeah, 19 to 23.
Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Please let me run and proclaim the good news to the king, that Yahweh has judged to save him from the hand of his enemies. But Joab said to him, You are not the man for the good news this day, but you shall proclaim the good news another day. However, you shall not proclaim the good news today, because the king's son has died. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. Now Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why would you run, my son, since you will have no reward for going? But whatever happens, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and passed the Cushite.
Perfect. Thank you. Were you going to say something? Okay.
I'm going to say, whoever brings this news.
Yeah. You can tell that Joab's nervous, right? Joab's he's being very careful on who gets to deliver this message because he knows that it's probably not going to be received the best. Yeah. This is actually just a really interesting part. Really this part and the next part of the chapter are very just intriguing to me because I just find it entertaining, how gung-ho Ahimaaz is in all of this. He's I want to tell the king! And it's why? I think he's just excited because he really loves David, but maybe he's too young to read the room and understand that David's not going to be happy about this news. I just find it kind of funny. Okay. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, first off, who is Ahimaaz? We've talked about him before. Other than, don't just say the son of Zadok, please.
Is he a son of the priest?
Yes, so Zadok's one of the priests. And so Ahimaaz, what's his relationship to David currently at this time? He's one of the spies.
Yeah.
Right? Remember, he's whenever David appointed the priests to basically once Hushai figured out what he was going to do with Ahithophel and everything, he passed the information on to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, who passed it on to their sons, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who then took the information to David. Right? So they have been the middlemen through all of this. And you can see why he might want to share the information with David. Right? He is the one who told David, hey, here's what's going to go down. Here's what Ahithophel wanted them to do. Here's what Hushai said to do. And now their whole plan worked. And so you can see why Ahimaaz is I want to go tell David this information. Yahweh has fought the battle and won for him. So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, says, please let me run and proclaim the good news to the king that Yahweh has judged to save him from the hand of his enemies. He's like, we've won. That battle was quick. That was awesome. Let me go tell the king. But Joab said to him, you're not the man for the good news this day. You'll proclaim the good news another day. However, you shall not proclaim the good news today because the king's son has died. So how does he respond?
I don't want David to know that Absalom's dead. Not yet.
So I don't think it's necessarily that he doesn't want him to know that Absalom is dead. He just doesn't want Ahimaaz to be the one to deliver the news. Why is that?
Because everybody who delivers the news dies.
Yeah, it seems like maybe Joab likes Ahimaaz, and he's like, hey man, I'd rather send an expendable person, just in case David lashes out. I appreciate your gung-ho-ness, but in the past, because keep in mind, Joab's the one who had Absalom killed. And he did this knowing that in killing Absalom, he was also possibly sentencing another person to death. Because he knows how David responds. David said, don't kill my enemies. And whenever somebody shows up and acts like it's good news that his enemies are dead, David doesn't typically like that. Because he's like, how dare you? And so Joab, he's not stupid, right? Joab is super smart. He's probably one of the smartest people that we meet in 1st and 2nd Samuel, if not the entire Bible. He's super intelligent. He knows how to read a room. And he's like, all right, dude, I get it. I appreciate your gusto. You're not the guy for today, right? Today, I need to find somebody who I just don't care about. You're not the man for the good news this day. I like that it keeps using the words good news. I can almost guarantee you that in like the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, I can almost guarantee you that it's the word euangelion, like gospel. You're not the man for the gospel this day. You shall proclaim the gospel another day. However, you shall not proclaim the good news gospel today, because the king's son has died. Like, just the repetition. You're not the guy. You're the guy for another day. You're not the guy today. Like, he's just like emphasizing, like, I really don't like the idea of you being the one to report this, and if you want to know why, it's because the king's son is dead. That's not, like, yes, I agree it's good news. I'm the one who ordered it and who kind of did it. David's not going to find it very good, right? He's like, so, I prefer you to not be that guy. Then Joab said to the Cushite, go, tell the king what you've seen. Who's the Cushite? We have no idea. I don't know. The Cushite, just some dude from the land of Cush, right? Just he's not an Israelite, not anybody that Joab cares about. Just some random Cushite guy. He's like, hey, you were at the battle. You saw what happened. Oh, you go tell the king. Joab, it's pretty messed up. Like he's basically like Joab doesn't know. He just knows that it's possible that he's sending this guy to his death. And so he's like, hey, Amos, no, you sit down here. You're like, he's not, like, he hasn't, like, he can't overtly say this. Like, he can't be like, hey, whoever delivers this news is going to die, possibly. Because, I mean, that'd be pretty messed up, right? But he knows David well, and so, as politely as possible, he's just trying to be like, Amos, sit down, dude. No, not now. No. I'd rather not. It's not you. It's the sad news that the king's son is dead. Somebody else needs to deliver it. Oh, yeah. Cushite. Yeah, dude. Yeah, if you want to go do it, that'd be great. Yeah, go for it. He's not stating it, but we know the full story. We know what he's thinking, right? So he tells some random Cushite, go tell the king what you've seen. So the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. He's like, all right, I'll do it. And so he just starts running. I always think it's interesting, like, just how stuff worked back then. Different, like, nowadays we're so used to, like, telephones and stuff. Whereas back then, it's like, you had news, you just run, right? I mean, that's, like, literally how marathons came into existence, right? Somebody wins a battle, and then, like, a dude, like, runs 26 miles, and he's like, we won! And then he falls over and dies, and they're like, I guess we'll create a 26-mile race to commemorate this man's valiant efforts. It's like, all right.
But imagine if you did deliver this news through phone.
Oh,
He'd,
yeah.
like, turn on location and be like, and then murder you.
David's like, I've got a particular set of skills that would be a nightmare to people like you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, but whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. He's like, dude, no, like, you don't understand. I'm so happy about what God has accomplished today. Like, let me go tell David. And Joab said, why would you run, my son, since there is no reward for going? He's like, dude, I don't know how else to say this to you without just telling you what's on my mind. Stop, please. Like, I don't want you to go. Like, he's just like fighting against it. He's like, you don't get a reward. I'm not paying any money for like running there and telling him you don't get anything. Please don't do it. But whatever happens, he said, I will run. And Ahimaaz is like, dude, I'm going to do it. You almost get the idea that this is like a young kid who's just got so much energy, and he's just like, I got to do something. I can't sit still. I'm so excited about what God's accomplished today. This is great. I got to go tell somebody. And so finally Joab's like, all right, run. He's like, go for it, dude. I mean, your funeral, not mine. You go tell him. Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and past the Cushite. He pulls a John and Peter situation here, right? Where John outran the Apostle Peter, right? Yeah, so you get the idea. This dude's just excited, right? The other dude's just, he's just delivering a message. He's just on an easy jog. Whereas Ahimaaz is like, I'm going to go tell the king about this. He's just like sprinting. It's just a really funny image to me. Also, I think it's heightened because this kid apparently just has no idea the turmoil he's going to bring upon David. Like it's kind of just really sad that this guy's just, he probably has a healthy perspective, right? He's like, God has accomplished this. He's the one person so far in this entire chapter who has mentioned Yahweh, right? So that's really good. Like, he has got his mind in the right place, but he hasn't thought about how the news is going to sound to David. And so he's just like, all right, I'm going to go tell David. Which leads us to the next portion. Sean, verses 24 through 27. Let's just do that part.
Okay. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running by himself. And the watchman called and told the king. And the king said, if he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth. And he came nearer and nearer. Then the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, this one also is bringing good news. And the watchman said, I see that the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, this is a good man, and comes with good news.
I like that y'all are laughing because y'all are picking up on the humor that's underlying all of this, which is weird. Like, this is just an interesting thing to me. Like, I'm glad that in this group we've kind of started picking up on like the emotional like flourishes of like some of the biblical writing, because a lot of times people just read the Bible with like a very like dry, like monotone nature. I'm glad we're picking up on the emotion of it, but I will admit that this is one of those places where the humor seems very inappropriate. But there's definitely like the person writing this definitely has humor in mind. Like, it's almost like just dark humor or something, right? To where I think it's almost like this dramatic irony of David not knowing what's going on here, and he's just being eternally optimistic. And then you have Ahimaaz, who is also eternally optimistic, and both of them have failed to meet the reality that is the darkness of the world or something. It's almost like that's the message being communicated here. I don't know. But I'm glad that we're laughing because it shows we're picking up on some stuff.
Also, another minor thing, I appreciate how they can pick up on who's coming based on how they run.
Yes.
Just from a runner's perspective.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, they could tell I was coming because my freshman year I just had really bad, I always used to stomp when I ran. You could tell I was coming up on you from a mile
I kid you
away.
not, Charlie, like I literally, a few days ago, I was driving through a neighborhood and I saw somebody running. It's probably like a quarter to a half mile away from me. And I was like, I think that's Charlie. And I started driving and I drove past and I was like, that was him.
You know what?
That's crazy.
I saw
I could just tell just from the running. I was like, and I haven't seen Charlie running since high school. That was like 10 years ago. But I could still, like, that's Charlie. Yeah.
I was fishing at the park yesterday and I see this extremely long stride and I'm like, yep, that's Charlie.
Yep, there you go. So, it's kind of funny. But, okay. So, now we shift, like, this was a film. You had Ahimaaz running into the distance, and then the camera zooms out, it pans up, and you cross over the land, and you go back down, and you zoom in on David, right? So you have these guys running over here, you go to David, and now you're seeing it from his perspective. Now David was sitting between the two gates. This is just where we left him, right? He was standing there at the gates, seeing the armies leave, and the idea is that he has been waiting there. It's almost like the story of the prodigal son, right? The father waiting for the prodigal son to return. It's almost like David's waiting for Absalom to return, right? He's waiting here. That's not what he's actually doing. He's just waiting to hear about news from the battle. But it works for the prodigal son analogy. David's waiting here. And ultimately, he kind of is waiting to hear if Absalom's returned because he finds it inconceivable that Absalom would be dead, right? Because, like, really, there's only two ways this battle could go from David's perspective. Either Absalom wins the battle, in which case the people are coming back to him, or they win the battle and Absalom is coming back to him, right? Because he told the people, don't kill Absalom, and the people have shown such devotion that it's unthinkable to him that Absalom's dead. And that's the one thing he really cares about, right? Because if Absalom wins the battle, well, guess what? God will be faithful to him and he'll win another day, right? And David's not worried about the kingdom. So ultimately, David probably feels pretty content where he's at, but he's still waiting for this news. And so he's sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and he raised his eyes and looked, and behold. I love whenever it slows down. Raised his eyes, looked, behold. Right? It's like slowing down as he's processing stuff. He raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running by himself. And the watchman called and told the king. And the king said, if he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth. So what is David thinking?
There's good news coming.
Yeah, why would he think that if it's just one man?
Because he's excited. It's good news.
Okay, what else?
They didn't all retreat.
Yeah. If it's a whole army of people just running to the gate, probably not a good sign, right? That probably would suggest that they are fleeing for their lives. If it's just one dude, that probably suggests that it's a messenger coming to report that something good has happened. Okay, so he says, if he's by himself, there's good news in his mouth. And he came nearer and nearer. And then, just over the hill, another person comes running. He's running fast. Then the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, I also just want to highlight, I mentioned this last week, notice how it keeps calling him the king. I just like that because it's emphasizing even though he's not on the throne, he's still the king. And the king said, this one also is bringing good news. Ironically, this is probably where David started questioning things a little bit because it's kind of weird. Like, one person's good news, but then two, why would you need to send two people? Except maybe, I guess, one person was going to deliver bad news, and then since that person left, another person was sent to deliver better news? I don't know. But David's optimistic here, right? At the very least, he doesn't know, but it's not a whole army. It's just two people. And I think he's confident enough to think that more than two people survived the battle, right? So, okay, two people are coming. It's still not an army. This is still good news. And the watchman said, I see that the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Okay, so now that the guy's getting closer and closer, he looks. He's like, I've seen that running before, right? This is the guy who he would come deliver us messages all the time. Right? We know he's running because he was one of our spies. Okay, it's Ahimaaz. And the king said, this is a good man, and he comes with good news. Huh, so what's David thinking?
You're gonna hear something good. Hopefully.
Yeah, he's like, if Ahimaaz is coming, Ahimaaz would only want to tell me the best news, which that's what Ahimaaz thinks he's doing, right? Ahimaaz is like, Yahweh has won the battle. And he's kind of just misreading some things. But David looks, he's like, well, Ahimaaz is a good guy. He is the one who delivered me the news that hopefully led to this victory. If he's the one in the lead, that's a good sign right there. And also, you have to realize that there's a reason Joab didn't want to send to Ahimaaz. Because it would send something misleading, right? Because as David sees Ahimaaz, he probably knows that Joab knows his character. And he's like, surely Joab wouldn't send somebody who would I'd want to kill, right? Because if Absalom's dead, David's going to be very upset. And the fact that it's Ahimaaz, Joab likes Ahimaaz. He wouldn't send Ahimaaz to me if Absalom was dead, because, come on. Whoever delivers that message probably not in for a good time. This is a good man with good news. Okay, cool. So Ahimaaz probably got some great information for me. All right, verses 28 through 30, Sean.
And Ahimaaz called and said to the king, peace! And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, blessed is Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king. Then the king said, is there peace with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz said, When Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. Then the king said, Turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still.
All right. What do we see here?
He's totally ignoring King David when he said, "How is Absalom?"
Yeah, I think he more just finds himself in a place where he doesn't know how to answer that question.
And figured out why he was not sent.
Yeah, he's realizing, yeah, this is a difficult thing to convey. There's a reason I wasn't sent to this errand. He's like, I don't know how to communicate this message. Yeah, so Ahimaaz calls and he says to the king, peace, shalom, which is a fitting thing to say because there is now peace in the land, right? Good, that is great news. And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, and this is great stuff, right? Blessed is Yahweh, your God. Yahweh's been mentioned twice in this chapter, both by the mouth of Ahimaaz, right? This dude, he's got his mind on the right thing, which is fitting because he's the son of a priest. You know what? There you go. Zadok is the first one to produce a good kid. Look at that. He's the first good father so far in the book of 1 Samuel. Ahimaaz and the king. Oh wait, hold on. Blessed is Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king. All right, so he delivers the good news, doesn't he? What does he say?
God delivered them?
God has given you victory in battle, my king. We have peace in the land. Glory be to God. Let's go back to Jerusalem and let's party. Right? Because ultimately, that is the main takeaway. Right? Like, this is a triumphant moment. Right? The kingdom has been spared. The enemy has been vanquished. This should be a good moment for, like, rejoicing. However, David isn't just focused on the kingdom anymore. Right? David is focused on his son. Then the king said, right? Like, he doesn't even acknowledge that first part. Normally, like, I don't even know what to make of this, right? Like, because I can understand where David's at emotionally, but normally David would say, praise be to God or something. But instead, he overlooks that first part. They've won the battle. He says, is there peace with the young man Absalom? Right? Okay, there's peace in the kingdom, but what about Absalom? That's who I care about. Is there peace with him? How is my son? Where is he at? How did he fare in all this? And Ahimaaz said, when Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. So what does he say?
I'm sure.
Yeah, he says, I'm not sure. I don't know. And I'd like to think that he's being honest here, other than the fact that Joab literally just told him a few verses earlier, the king's son is dead. That's why I'm not sending you. Right? And so he does know that the king's son is dead. He just doesn't know how to say that to David. Because I think he was showing up expecting David to be really excited about the peace. But instead, David wasn't concerned chiefly about the peace in the kingdom. He was more concerned about the peace between him and his son. And so he didn't receive the reaction he expected, and now he's being confronted by a question he wasn't prepared to answer. Is there peace? How about me and my son? Are we good? And he's just like, we were in such a rush to get out of there. Joab sent me, and he sent the other guy, and I didn't see what happened. There's a lot of stuff that happened, but there's another guy coming right behind me. I'm just one of the servants, one of the king's servants, your servants. I love you, king. It's like, Joab sent the king's servant and the other servant, and there was a tumult. I don't know what it was. I couldn't answer that question. Sorry. Like, you very quickly realize that this guy's like, This did not go how I expected, because I think he expected David to just rejoice at the news that Yahweh has triumphed, which normally David would have. But David's a father, and things get complicated, right? Then the king said, turn aside and stand here, right? So he can't even rejoice until he knows the information. Turn aside, stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. So Ahimaaz is like, oh crap. And he just goes and stands there. All right. let's do verses 31 and 32.
Okay. Behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, "Let my lord the king receive good news, for Yahweh has judged to save you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." Then the king said to the Cushite, "Is there peace with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "Let the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise up against you for evil, be as that young man."
Perfect. All right. The second messenger arrives. What does he say?
Absalom's gone.
Yeah.
He's
He's dead.
dead.
He doesn't say it in as straightforward terms, though, right? he had some class about how he delivered it. So behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, "Let my lord the king receive good news." Now, I just want to say that this dude is delivering a message how it should be delivered, right? This is like a professional messenger who knows what he's doing. "Let my lord the king receive good news, for Yahweh has judged to save you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." So he's saying the same thing that Ahimaaz delivered, right? But the focus is once again on Yahweh has delivered you, which is cool coming from the mouth of a Cushite, right? So this is not an Israelite, but he is giving credit to the God of Israel, which is just a good sign for how David conducts his kingdom. But the king says to the Cushite, "Is there peace with the young man Absalom?" Right? He's got like a one-track mind right now. Like they're trying to tell him about the battle, but there's one thing he's concerned about. It's literally like the prodigal son story. Like he's at the gate, and he doesn't care what else happens. He just wants his son to come home. How is my son? Is there peace between us? Interesting. This just crossed my mind. Absalom, Absalom, father of peace. Interesting. It's kind of like just I just thought about that. Like my father's peace. That's weird. So whenever you said that's probably a play on words. Is there peace with the young man Absalom? Like there's probably a play on words there. That's funny. Okay, I'd never processed that. Okay, is there peace with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, "Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man." This is as nice a way as possible of saying your son is dead. How does he communicate it, though?
He says that he went down with your enemies.
Yeah.
In a way.
Well, he's saying, here's the issue. How he delivers it is fitting for a royal decree. It is not the most appropriate way to deliver it to a father who is now going to be grieving. Right? Because he's saying, it's almost like the equivalent of saying, "My king, I hope that every single one of your enemies meets that same fate." Right? Like, that guy, he met a rough end. That's kind of what he's saying. When it comes to delivering a royal message about victory in battle, that is a great way to deliver it, right? Man, your enemy who is leading a revolt against you, I would not want to share that guy's fate. In fact, I hope all of your enemies meet that same fate. Like, that's what he's saying. Normally, that would be great news. Unless you're a father who realized that you're kind of responsible for your son's rebellion. And yes, Absalom bears the brunt of that responsibility, but at this point in his life, David has a lot of regrets. Right? Ever since the whole David and Bathsheba thing, he knows that all this is consequences for his sin. And he knows he didn't handle things right with Absalom. And he wanted to go out and fight, and he wanted to spare Absalom. He gave them one instruction, spare Absalom. And you know this entire time, he's just been holding out for hope that maybe, just maybe, he would be able to meet with Absalom one final time and reconcile. Even though Absalom had done all these things, Absalom drew the line in the sand, peace was not an option, David seemed to optimistically hold on to that hope. And that guy has just taken that hope away from him. He says, "My king, I hope that all your enemies meet the same fate." Which is saying, your son is dead. And I hope all your other enemies die. Which is a really nice way of talking to a king, but not to a father.
Yeah, the wording's kind of like whenever when Samuel told Saul he was going to be like his the day he died the next day, he would be.
Oh yeah, you'll be with me soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Verse 33, final verse of the chapter.
Okay. Then the king trembled and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son. My son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom. My son, my son."
Isn't that sad? We're going to pick up with this next week, and we're going to see that how David responds here is very complicated. Because David finds himself in the tricky situation. Once again, politics, it's a scary game. Right? He finds himself in the weird place where he's both a king and a father. And the question becomes, how do you respond to the situation? Do you respond as a father or as a king? He's responding as a father right now. The issue is he probably should have responded as a father to Absalom long before. Before, he responded as a king, but now when it means the most, he responds as a father. But we'll address that in the next chapter. Right here, it's just sad. Right? And that's just one of the things that I like to highlight here. And I'm kind of glad the chapter ends right here, because it kind of ends on a somber note. And usually we immediately jump to like the happier stuff. I like ending on stuff like this. It just leaves you like reflecting. It's like, this is just sad. Like, this is the world, right? And this is David, a man after God's own heart, having to go through all this. Which suggests that in our own lives, sometimes there's going to be consequences for sin. And sometimes they can be extreme. This is the third son that David has lost, right? The first one was the first child of Bathsheba, who died just within weeks of being born. The second one was Amnon, who Absalom killed, and now Absalom's died, right? Third son that has died, and David is just left to mourn this. The king trembled and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. So in the presence of all the people, right? He's not doing this on the ground. He is up in front of everybody, elevated, and he starts to weep. And thus he said as he walked, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." This is like, I'm not a father, but it's not that hard to empathize with him, right? Because I can imagine if I had a son, I don't care what he had done, even if he had led a rebellion against you, you're still eaten up by it. Especially if he especially with the guilt that he probably feels over this whole situation. Like, he just wanted to make things right. And he told them, spare Absalom. He told them publicly so that everybody in the army knew. And still Absalom died. And so now he has no choice, but he just screams, "My son, my son, my son." You know, he hasn't really called Absalom my son that much throughout this whole thing. But we've seen over the last few chapters his affinity for Absalom growing. Right? At first, he was just Absalom. You know, don't even get near me. And then earlier in the chapter, he's the young man Absalom. And then now that Absalom's dead, my son, my son, my son. It's really sad. So chapter 19, David will return to Jerusalem, and Joab is going to have some very harsh words for David, especially in how David responds to this whole situation. And a lot of times people will just immediately take Joab's side and say that Joab's correct. I'm hoping that next week we'll take a much more nuanced approach. And we'll see that it's not as easy as people typically try to make it. Which I think is the point of 1 and 2 Samuel. Right? It's always a matter of getting back to the heart of all of this. Which leads me to just final few minutes here. We haven't really talked a lot about application here because sometimes it's very easy to just get caught up in the story and learning about it. What are some things that we can learn from this? Obviously, I was about to say our names are not David and Absalom, but my name is David. But we are not kings or wannabe kings of Israel. We are not living in the 10th century BC. We are not currently dealing with the murder of one of our sons by his cousin, who is our nephew. We're not dealing with that stuff. But this is still the Word of God, and I think there's probably still stuff we can learn from it. What can we learn?
To love and forgive your enemies.
Okay.
And do good to those that want to hurt you or harm you.
Well,
or kill you.
And then sin had consequences that David still has to see his kids die, which is sad.
Yeah, that's kind of the continual application. We haven't even taken every week, right? Sin has consequences. And this is something that you don't want to go too weird with this, because sometimes you'll get to some places that you see wrestled throughout the whole Bible where some people will say that every time something bad happens, it's a result of sin, right? That's not what the Bible says, right? Because that's what you have Job. His friends are like, dude, what sin did you commit for your life to be going down the drain? And then you have the apostles going up to Jesus being like, hey, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So some people almost assume that every time something bad happens in your life, it's a result of sin. But the Bible proves that that's not the case. And as a result, some people go to the other extreme. And they say, no, God doesn't, like, there's no consequences for sin. Well, that's not the case either, right? It's much more nuanced than that. Sometimes life is just bad because we live in a sinful world. Sometimes God is testing you. Sometimes it is a consequence for sin, and he's disciplining you, right? And it could be any of those things. Sometimes it could just be the ramifications of living in a sinful world, and you're having to deal with the consequences of another person's sin. Think about how many people in this story who are unnamed are having to deal with the consequences of David's sin. And it's not directly a discipline for them or a test for them. It is simply living in a sinful world. And so that's something we have to realize. Whenever life goes bad, there could be a number of reasons why. It could be the world's sinful. It could be that you're sinful and you're being disciplined, or it could be that God's testing you, or a number of other things. But any of those are legitimate possibilities, and God is still good amidst all of that. And you do have to remember that. But yeah, David, he's going through it. And God, sometimes like our perspective of God sometimes is very limited whenever we think of God's goodness. But I'm preparing to talk about this tomorrow on Wednesday at church, that whenever God defines who he is in Exodus 34, basically he says, I'm going to pass before Moses, and he says, I'm going to tell you who I am. And he says, Yahweh, Yahweh, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in grace and truth. And he just explains who he is. One thing he says is that he shows hesed towards thousands, and he is willing to forgive all sorts of sin and transgressions and iniquities. But another thing he says is that he visits the sins of the father upon the third and fourth generation. Right? And that's not saying that a son is guilty of the sin of his father. It's saying that sometimes the future generations will have to reap the consequences of that sin. So if you go and you squander all your money going out and gambling, your kids are going to have to deal with the fact that you are now in debt. And they're going to have to deal with the consequences of that sin. Right? And that might be felt to the third and fourth generation. Right? If you go out and you're like some public figure who goes out and has this whole like cheating scandal, your family is going to have to deal with the public backlash that comes with that to the third and fourth generation. Right? And so that's something that in God's goodness, he allows that to happen. And he's still good. And sometimes we might be looking, we're like, wow, God, why would you do that? Why are these other people having to suffer as a result of one person's sin? I mean, first off, he can do what he wants. But I think it's also just to highlight to us how bad sin is. Right? If you realize that your sin doesn't just affect you, it affects everybody around you, you're less likely to do it. Because sometimes I'm like, if this sin just affects me, I'm willing to deal with the consequences. I want to go sin. But if I realize, oh my gosh, my sin can affect Sean, it can affect Ben, it can affect Maverick, all of a sudden I don't want to sin anymore. And so I think that's one reason why God in his goodness would allow that. One good application thing is just realizing the consequences that come from sin. But what's something else that we could maybe reflect on from this chapter? Keep your hair short? That was a joke. Y'all laughed, but in case the people on the recording didn't hear the laughter, just wanted to clarify that wasn't the genuine application point. Come on, think deeply. What can we draw out of this? It doesn't even have to be one of the main points. Discernment and communication. Maybe be careful how you communicate things to people, and be aware of how what you're saying might be taken by the other person. Right? Ahimaaz and the Cushite, both of them probably could have learned a little bit about that. Ahimaaz maybe needed to learn a little bit more information and maybe empathize with David a little bit more, and the Cushite probably just needed to learn a little bit of empathy.
I liked the the part where the terrain fought on behalf of the people, rather
Yeah.
than people winning. So maybe there's something to be said that God still fights in ways that are less than obvious if you're on the right side of things.
I mean, that's just like a theological truth that we don't really think about nowadays. But biblically speaking, battles are not just between humans,
So,
right? Like God is like there is a whole spiritual realm that it's only mentioned like here and there throughout the Bible, but almost every battle is not just viewed as a battle between like man and man. It is a battle between like the powers of the air, and God is the one ultimately deciding this stuff, which is just interesting because usually we relegate things to just like human to human interactions, whereas biblically speaking, that's just not the worldview it has. It's like no, like if God wants, He can win a battle by using a forest. And from a human perspective, it might look like people just tripping and falling, but ultimately, God's the one deciding who wins the battle. So, and like nobody would ever look at that and just think, "Oh wow, I guess God was fighting there." But once you have the perspective of David being the anointed king of Judah and Israel, and he's the one winning the battle despite being vastly outnumbered, all of a sudden you're like, maybe that wasn't a coincidence.
And also maybe
you know?
God gave insight to him for strategy, but it's not just strategy, it's like a supernatural thing where the guerrilla warfare gave them such an advantage that those numbers are multiplied. So they were greatly given advantage in a way that they didn't have otherwise. So he's blessed with like extra insight as king.
Yeah.
So he's extra smart.
Yeah. Then final application would just be keep your pride in check. Right? Don't become like Absalom. Because he like I mentioned this at the very beginning, but his fate was literally the same as what Ahithophel had planned, right? To where Absalom ended up being the one whose army fled, who was isolated, and who ended up being killed in order to bring peace. Whereas originally that's what they planned towards David, and ultimately it was his own pride that brought about his own undoing, right? If only he had left the hair cut short, maybe he would have escaped to live another day. But instead, or if he had it like in a had it in a helmet or something, I have no idea. But this guy, his luscious locks were his claim to fame, and ultimately, it led to his destruction. Also, don't be a Joab. I mean, so far we haven't seen the negative effects of Joab here, but Joab's got it coming for him eventually. Submit to the anointed one, right? And what he says, do it. So the Messiah, Christ, listen to what he says. Don't be like, nah, I think I can do things better. Just submit. So there's that. All right, one of y'all want to close it out in prayer? Somebody who didn't pray at the beginning. Go for it, Maverick.
Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this Bible study. I thank you for all the applications we got from your word. I thank you for everything, but most importantly, Lord, I thank you for you, Lord, the giver, and not the gift. And I love you, Lord, with everything, and just I love you, and it's in your name I pray. Amen.
Cool.